Welcome to this explainer on the crucible of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Today, we're immersing ourselves in one of the most fiercely contested civil rights battles in American history. Now, the ADA is often viewed today as this simple, inevitable piece of legislation, right? Just a moral victory that organically happened. But history is never inevitable. This was a brutal, hard-fought war that played out on concrete steps in the boardrooms of corporate America and in the absolute highest courts of the land. We are going to explore the deeply human stakes, the brilliant tactical strategies, and the profound, often unintended consequences of a revolution that literally reshaped the modern world.
To really understand the raw intensity of this fight, we have to drop right into the visceral reality of March 12, 1990. Picture this. Over 1,000 disability rights activists have descended on the United States Capitol. But they aren't just standing there holding signs. In a breathtaking display of sheer physical determination, dozens of protesters abandon their wheelchairs, their crutches, and their power chairs. They literally drop to the concrete. You can hear the chanting, the painful physical scraping of bodies dragging against unforgiving stone, all while stunned lawmakers watch from balconies above. This was the legendary Capitol Crawl, organized by the grassroots group ADAPT, and it was a desperate act that forced the entire nation to witness the brutal, everyday reality of navigating an inaccessible world.
Exactly 100 stone steps. This wasn't just a physical barrier, it was the ultimate glaring symbol of systemic, institutional indifference. A system that walled out over 40 million disabled Americans every single day. For generations, society had built an entire architecture that simply did not account for their existence. These activists were completely exhausted from waiting for a stalled Congress to act. They were showing, through extreme physical agony, that simply trying to participate in American civic life was a grueling uphill battle against concrete. That agonizing protest shattered a political deadlock with stunning speed. The day after the crawl, police actually hauled away 104 people, arresting them right inside the Capitol Rotunda. The jarring national image of disabled citizens being dragged out of the halls of democracy captivated the media and created this immense pressure that finally forced the political friction to give way. Just 4 months later, President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law, famously declaring, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." But to understand how this rapid capitulation actually happened, we have to rewind.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, the foundation of resistance, decades of isolation.
The explosion of the ADA absolutely didn't happen overnight. It was built on a massive foundation of fierce resistance against decades of institutionalization, a time when disabled individuals were often warehoused, out of sight, subjected to a medical model that viewed them simply as problems to be fixed. The tension was compounding for years. In 1977, activists staged intense sit-ins just to demand baseline civil rights. By 1988, a massive uprising at a university signaled a total rejection of the status quo. And by 1990, as we saw, the movement had unified into an unstoppable national force. These were not isolated events, folks. They were a synchronized escalation of tactics, proving the disability community was no longer asking for charity, they were demanding equity. Take the Deaf President Now uprising in 1988, for instance. Total psychological earthquake. Gallaudet University was the world's premier institution for the deaf, yet its leadership was historically hearing. When another hearing president was appointed, the board basically claimed that deaf people were not ready to function in a hearing world. Incensed, the students barricaded the campus, burned effigies, and took their fight straight to the national media. It was a profound philosophical realization for the country. An inability or refusal to communicate on the hearing world's terms was not a disability. It was a unique culture demanding its rightful autonomy. Actually, the legal blueprint for this whole revolution was forged a decade earlier over Section 504. This was a foundational law stating you couldn't discriminate in federally funded programs. The problem? The government simply refused to issue the regulations to actually enforce it. So, in April 1977, activists stormed federal buildings. In San Francisco, individuals with severe physical and medical needs literally put their lives on the line, staging a grueling 26-day sit-in. They slept on hard floors without running water or their regular medical backup until the government finally caved and signed the regulations. Talk about high stakes.
Which brings us to Section 2, the political battlefield, power, economics, and rights.
Drafting the ADA was an incredibly intense political chess match. We are talking about the most sweeping, disruptive civil rights legislation in U.S. history. In 1989, it was entirely unclear which side would actually win. This was a monumental clash of two unyielding forces. On one side, you have the civil rights imperative, a desperate demand for basic human integration. On the other side, sheer economic dread. Corporate America looked at the ADA and saw catastrophic compliance costs, endless retrofitting of physical spaces, and a tidal wave of litigation. And honestly, this was a terrifying, entirely valid reality for businesses attempting to survive what they perceived as a fundamental threat to the bottom line of American capitalism. To navigate this political minefield, the movement needed unparalleled tactical genius. Enter Patricia Wright, a legally blind activist rightfully known on Capitol Hill as the General. She faced an immensely difficult internal conflict. How do you unite over 50 deeply fragmented groups, the deaf community, wheelchair users, the blind community, who historically had completely different needs and had never fought as a single army before? Well, Wright managed to forge them into a cohesive lobbying force, negotiating directly with power brokers to ensure the core of the ADA remained fully intact.
It was a true David versus Goliath scenario. The opposition was well-funded, immensely powerful, and completely terrified. Greyhound bus lines claimed that making their buses accessible would destroy their rural routes. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a lobbying behemoth that rarely ever lost fights on Capitol Hill, warned of disastrous impacts on small businesses. Even some religious groups fought the bill, specifically opposing its protections for people living with HIV, arguing that making churches accessible would bankrupt them. So the ADA was in constant, very real peril of being gutted before it even reached the floor.
Amidst this high-stakes political battlefield, the bill found an incredibly unexpected champion in the White House. President George H.W. Bush viewed disability rights through an intimate, deeply personal lens. He wasn't just calculating political capital here. His psychology was driven by lived experience. He had lost a daughter to leukemia, he had a son with a learning disability, and a beloved uncle who lived with quadriplegia. For Bush, erasing the stigma of disability and bringing millions into the economic mainstream aligned perfectly with his vision of an inclusive American opportunity society. Now, let's look at how they actually did it in Section 3, the anatomy of the law, dismantling the wall. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the law was actually built. The ADA was designed as a highly calibrated, multi-tiered legislative weapon meant to fundamentally rewire how American society functions. Each title targets a very specific pillar. Title I tackles the workplace, enforced by the EEOC. Title II forces state and local governments, plus public transit, to finally open their doors. Title III targets the private sector, your restaurants, hotels, and stores, demanding they remove architectural barriers where readily achievable. And Title IV ensures the telecommunications grid is accessible for the deaf and hard of hearing. It's a comprehensive web of access. But the absolute linchpin of the entire ADA was this concept of reasonable accommodation. Basically, it meant employers had to actively modify jobs or environments to allow disabled workers to succeed unless it caused an undue hardship. But, terms like readily achievable and undue hardship are highly subjective. This legal ambiguity guaranteed that the true battleground would immediately shift from the halls of Congress directly to the courtrooms, pitting the vision of a truly inclusive labor market against the corporate world's terror of unpredictable legal costs.
When the ink finally dried in 1990, the scale of the victory was just staggering. Think about this number for a second. 43 million. That was the estimated number of Americans with disabilities meant to be liberated by this exact legislative architecture. 43 million lives profoundly altered, theoretically granted the independence, freedom of choice, and control over their own destinies that non-disabled Americans had literally always taken for granted.
Let's move to our final segment, Section 4, Legacy and Unfinished Battles, the Economic and Legal Reality. So, the passage of a law is never the end of the story, right? In many ways, 1990 was just the opening salvo of a brand new set of battles. Consider this incredibly surprising economic fallout. According to research from the National Bureau of Economic Research, in the years immediately following the ADA, the employment probability for disabled workers actually declined by 7 to 10%. Why? Well, because the very protections designed to help them, specifically those unpredictable costs of accommodations and the sheer fear of litigation, created an unintended disincentive. Many employers quietly avoided hiring disabled workers altogether, just to avoid the legal risk. And unfortunately, the physical barriers didn't just vanish overnight either. Years after the ADA was passed, a man named George Lane, who used a wheelchair, was summoned to a county courthouse in Tennessee. There was no elevator. To attend his own hearing, he was forced to abandon his wheelchair and physically crawl up the courthouse steps. It's a haunting echo of the Capitol crawl, proving that systemic physical exclusion was still deeply, deeply entrenched in local governments. When Lane and others understandably sued, the states fiercely fought back. They argued all the way to the Supreme Court that the ADA was massive federal overreach, invoking the 11th Amendment. This was a brilliant, highly technical legal loophole. States claimed sovereign immunity, essentially meaning disabled citizens couldn't sue the state for damages over inaccessible public buildings. The battle for rights had shifted straight from the streets to the highest courts, revealing exactly how desperately states sought to gut the ADA's enforcement power to avoid massive financial and structural mandates. So where does that leave us? Today, the struggle continues with absolute urgency. Yes, the ADA radically changed our architecture and our social awareness, but true equity remains an active, daily fight. Advocates are locked in combat right now, confronting invisible hiring discrimination, battling states that use sovereignty to dodge compliance, and constantly trying to balance the unwavering mandate of civil rights with the very real frictions of economics and business logistics. We've seen the curb cuts, the ramps, and the accessible transit that reshaped our physical world. But as you look around your own workplace, your own community, maybe even your own digital spaces, ask yourself, has the shameful wall of exclusion that President Bush spoke of truly tumbled down, or has it simply adapted, taking on new, invisible, and far more insidious forms? The crucible of the ADA teaches us that the fight for human dignity doesn't end with a signature. It is a legacy we are all responsible for building every single day. Thank you for joining me for this explainer.